so that now we are recording the session. Thank you all for joining. To announce that we are recording this session so that we can share the recording with others in the future. So please be aware that the session is being recorded. Okay, so welcome to the Carter School Peace Week. This session is the Emergence of Illiberal Peace, Concept and Cases. As I said, we are recording this session. I'm Susan Allen. I am part of the Center for Peacemaking Practice at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm part of the leadership team of the Better Evidence Project at the Carter School. And I'm moderating this session on behalf of the Southwest Asia Group, which is convened by Dr. Christopher Mitchell. Our panelists today will be in this order: Dr. Anna Ohanyan, the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College; Bahruz Samadov, a doctoral student at Charles University in Prague. They'll be speaking together. Then we'll hear from Tatsushi Arai, Associate Professor at the School of Peace and Conflict Studies at Kent State University; Dr. Philip Gamaghelyan, Assistant Professor at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies, University of San Diego. Then we'll hear from Esra Dilek, a Fulbright Scholar at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And then finally, Christopher Mitchell, our Emeritus Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at the Carter School at George Mason. So before we go further with this session, I will turn to Dr. Christopher Mitchell to introduce the concept of illiberal peace and this panel. He was the inspiration for pulling this group together. And I'd like to ask you, Chris, what is illiberal peace? Then after we hear from Chris, we'll turn to each of our panelists and their presentations. I will be strict in moderating, and I will be cutting people off if necessary when we get to 20 minutes. Hopefully we'll have good discussions within 15 to 20 minutes per presentation. And then there will be time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. So please save your questions for the end. Make notes to yourself if you need to before we get to that discussion session at the end. Okay, without further ado then, Chris, what is illiberal peace and why did you bring this group together? Thank you.
Well, I think the straight answer, Susan, is I haven't the vaguest idea. And that was really the reason that we had the idea of pulling this group together. The Southwest Asia Group is a network of, in many cases except mine, young scholars who have an interest in a particular part of the world, but are also very much involved in this whole business of what kinds of peace are there, and the emergence of this slightly dubious form of peace, which is illiberal. And I'm not quite sure, what it means. So we decided to put together a panel and ask people to, to interpret their instructions very liberally. So we've asked Anna and Bahruz if they'll talk about their understanding of the concept, and then some of us are going to talk about various kinds of or examples of peace that we have come across. And I hope at the end of the session, after the couple of hours, we'll have a much better idea of what the answer to your question is. I'm baffled myself. Are we talking about authoritarian peace or victor's peace or post-liberal peace or imposed peace? There are lots of pieces. So that's what we'll be trying to do over the next couple of hours. And I was going to ask Anna and Bahruz if they could enlighten us for a while on the general concept. So, Anna, I can't see whether Bahruz has actually managed to get on board. So,
yeah,
yes, we have them here.
I'm here.
Oh,
Great.
good.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, terrific. All right. So you two, please lead off and tell us how to answer the question.
Bahruz and I do realize that our task here is to present whatever we surveyed the literature, there are some concepts, competing concepts. As you noted, Chris, we try to answer the question as to whether illiberal peace is anything new. Is there even a need for this, a new concept? So clearly there's a need for us to talk about concept development in general. And we try to do that, absolutely, but the way we try to do it is to reverse engineer the concept, if you will. We do have later on in this panel a specific presentation on Nagorno-Karabakh, but I hope our presenters who will be covering will not be upset if we also focus on Nagorno-Karabakh. So for the following reason, I don't know how much you have followed in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, the second war, 44-day war in the fall. The post-war outcome of that war was significant because it really left previously rules-based, very weak peace process completely marginalized, and the post-war situation moved into the terrain of primarily Russia, which introduced its peacekeeping troops into Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as Azerbaijan, but also Turkey, much less so. So in this respect, this particular war was this particular outcome is somewhat similar to, for example, cases of Sri Lanka, which is also a case that is usually described as a case of illiberal peace process, peace building, if we can call it that way. But I'm going to turn this over to Bahruz, who will talk about the post-war situation, and then I will build on Bahruz's presentation to sort of chart broader concepts, competing concepts, as to essentially trying to answer the question as to whether we even need this concept at all.
Thank you, Anna, for presentation and for words. Yeah, basically, yeah, we was thinking about this, and actually, in few days, it's like an anniversary of the war between Azerbaijan from one side and Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia from the other side. And the situations that we have now are, yeah, we can even ask the question, is it peace or not? From one side, we can argue that yes, it is peace because there is no ongoing clashes. If before it was partially frozen conflict, now it's kind of like, yes, there is a conflict transformation. And we can argue here that the situation can remind us situation of illiberal peace, and how we understand this concept in relation to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or let's say Nagorno-Karabakh post-conflict situation here. First of all, the feature of this conflict now is that there is the Russian peacekeeping mission, which is dislocated in Nagorno-Karabakh. From one side, we can say that it's a colonial legacy. We have third side, which comes and says, enough, we should stop war, and the mission is dislocated here, and it guarantees the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh can live in this situation. But from the other side, why it is illiberal peace? Because there is no dialogue, and there is no direct communication between Azerbaijani and Armenian communities of Nagorno-Karabakh from one side, and between Azerbaijani authorities and the authorities of Nagorno-Karabakh from the other side. Because the Azerbaijani authorities have always, let's not just marginalized, but excluded Nagorno-Karabakh from the conflict, claiming that there are two sides, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and Nagorno-Karabakh as just like the side that has never been recognized as a side. And now the same policy remains. So that's why we still can ask, can we even observe the proper conflict transformation? So the transformation itself is not complete. And that's why we call it illiberal peace, because there is no dialogue and there is no complete transformation. And third thing here also worth mentioning is the national identity in Azerbaijan, because I work on it in my PhD work, and I would like to mention it because it's very important here, because the national identity of Soviet Azerbaijan has been built around the narratives of loss. Loss of Nagorno-Karabakh as a national trauma. And I call this kind of nationalism as an antagonistic nationalism, which identifies the other foreigner as radically different and inferior actor. In this case, Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia being Armenian itself, which is a threat for the self. Of course, this identity legitimizes the use of violence and the use of complete othering the enemy of the other, and that's why it is antagonistic nationalism, and the self becomes articulated through a solidified chain of equivalence that homogenizes the self, and the enemy also is homogenized because there are not different Armenians, but they're one Armenian enemy, and there is no differentiation between Nagorno-Karabakh from one side and Armenia from the other side. So it is why it is again illiberal, because now the national identity in Azerbaijan hasn't been transformed. The image of the other remains the same, and there are material evidences of it. For example, now the national identity, of course, there is a change. Now the national identity in Azerbaijan is built around the narratives of victory, and there are material evidences. For example, there are parks, there's a military trophies park in Baku that completely dehumanizes the Armenian other soldiers and the losses, and the life of these soldiers is fantasized as a life that are not worth grievance. And from the other side, in Hadrut, which was previously populated by Armenians, now is now liberated, and there are not. There's like just military posts there, and you can say that there's like ethnic cleansing took place. And for example, there is a monument of Iron Fist, which also symbolizes the victory. And overall, this is the situation of illiberal peace. Yes, the Nagorno-Karabakh remains there. There is no clashes, there is no skirmishes happening. There's a Russian peacekeeping mission, but at the same time, there is no dialogue, and not just the absence of. There is not just absence of dialogue, but there is also exclusion, which is not transformed, and which remains the same in a level of state ideology.
Very good. I'll continue now. And again, as Bahruz mentioned, we are focusing on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict because on the one hand, right now, the post-war situation is under the control of pretty much very liberal powers on the ground, great powers. But at the same time, the violence, the active violence, we should say, has stopped. Obviously, there are the key issues of status, issues of incompatibility that are at the core of the conflict have not been resolved, and we could have a whole panel focus only on the ceasefire agreement itself, the quality of the ceasefire agreement as an instrument to manage that intractability. Now, there have been some definitions of an authoritarian conflict management or illiberal peace building. I do want to preface by saying that when you do engage in a deeper historical sort of search, it's I hate to admit that actually it's liberal peace building that may be an aberration, and that throughout much of the imperial histories, it's authoritarian conflict management, coercive, illiberal peace-building processes that have been used in managing, for example, multi-ethnic fabric of various empires in Eurasia, for instance. So with that, perhaps we could come back to it. But in terms of specific, more working definition, there is one provided by Lewis, Hettershaw, and Warren in 2018. They define authoritarian conflict management as one that disregards genuine negotiations between conflict parties, one that rejects international mediation, constraints on the use of force, one that disregards calls to address underlying structural causes of conflict, and instead relies on state coercion and hierarchical structures of power. In this particular piece, 3 specific mechanisms of authoritarian conflict management have been distinguished. Number 1, suppressing alternative information and interpretation of events. Bahruz already described a little. In the case of, for example, whether we take the case of Sri Lanka, Rwanda, Turkey relative to Kurdish conflict, very often counterinsurgency label is applied to it. Sri Lanka in particular, terrorism label is applied to it, essentially taking out the actual issues that are driving such conflicts. Number 2, authoritarian regimes produce official discourse, silencing the voice of the other party and delegitimizing it. And number 3, political, symbolic, and physical dominance of the space by the authoritarian illiberal powers that are in control of the new post-war situation. This might include military patrols, encampment, occupation, checkpoints, forced resettlement of civilians, demographic engineering. And of course, these tactics differ as to whether we're talking about intrastate civil war or we're talking about interstate conflicts. So in terms of, so essentially the overarching question is that scholars who are raising these issues is whether there is or should there be an authoritarian turn in conflict management? Are authoritarian mechanisms of conflict management new, differing from long history of coercive conflict management that has been so prevalent in various imperial states? Now, in terms of rationale, why should we be even talking about this particular question? On the one hand, first, numbers of negotiated settlements that were prevalent in the immediate post-Cold War period have been declining somewhat. So whether this is linked to democratic declines in general, the weakening of rules-based world order, the fact is that the quote-unquote liberal powers, Western powers, seem to have lesser appetite in engaging in various conflict processes. I realize as I'm saying this, that you might be thinking of Afghanistan, United States pull out of Afghanistan, which kind of raises all kinds of questions as to whether liberal Western powers are always liberal in the way they approach conflict management. Number 2, conflict management norms, institutions, and legitimacy are highly dependent on overarching world order of the time. So whether we like it or not, I think the weakening of the rules-based world order at the very least challenges the emphasis on rules-based negotiated settlement as a form of conflict management. Scholars writing on illiberal peace building as a practice have argued that considering the contested nature of this liberal rules-based world order, liberal peace building has been again much weakened, political legitimacy has been suffering. In terms of theory, illiberal authoritarian methods of conflict management have been understudied because they usually have been simply described as victor's peace, and studies on militarized ending of wars are not that many. Wallenstein's book, Quality of Peace, provides a very good overview in comparing militarized and negotiated settlements, comparison of the two, as to how effective they are in producing quality peace, and he details that in his work. So to put it simply, I guess we're asking, should we give dictators a chance in peace building? That is the very basic and admittedly simplistic and perhaps a cynical way of summarizing that literature. Liberal peace building has been contested within academic and policy circles, which also raises the question as to whether illiberal peace building should be understood and emerge as an alternative. Very quickly, my position in this is that I don't think liberal peace building has been even given a chance. Now, I realize that we don't have much of there are time constraints. What I would like to do, and I again like to summarize, to provide conceptual clarity to this. I'm going to share my screen, which has 2 charts that I produced after Bahruz and I talked. So one way to think about illiberal and liberal peace building approaches, and this chart is not fully populated, by the way, is to think in terms of conflict termination, whether the particular conflict was terminated through militarized methods or negotiated settlement. So that's the pattern of termination. That's the horizontal. This is what you see. And on a vertical, you see the fabric of the post-war order that is emerging, whether it is negotiated, driven by dialogue, inclusive, developmental, participatory, and you can have, I think the significance of this table is that you still can have technically militarized ending, coercive victor's peace, but which provides an opening for more inclusive conflict management, more liberal peace outcomes. Perhaps the Balkan Wars and post-Dayton peace building would fill in this regard. Here, on the other hand, post-war hegemonic, divisive stabilization without engagement, interest-based, as opposed to rights-based, this particular outcome is not very likely to emerge. For, I guess that is the question. Can that particular order emerge from negotiated settlements? So I'm trying to sort of reshuffle our thinking about separate the pattern of termination versus the post-war conditions that emerge. And this chart, essentially, what we try to do here, if we put, and again, I'm probably simplifying here, liberal peace building, illiberal peace building, the chart is self-explanatory. We try to distinguish, we try to separate as to how they differ in terms of a process, in terms of outcomes. You can have an illiberal process. Can you have an illiberal process that produces a liberal outcome in terms of principle, ideology, values, actors, institutions? The bottom line is that both the pattern of termination as well as the post-war conditions are highly consequential, not only how that conflict is resolved, how durable it is, what quality peace is established, but also what happens to conflict parties in general. One of the fascinating findings from the literature on victory consolidation is that victorious powers end up deepening authoritarianism inside their states. And unfortunately, we do see that in Azerbaijan, which is worrisome, not just for Azerbaijani people, but for the region as a whole. And I will simply conclude that the question I would like to leave you with is how should we evaluate and assess illiberal peace building, what the standards should be. And I would argue, reverse engineering, that we know a lot from peace and conflict research that as to what works, what does not. We still know that democracy as participatory politics adds to local capacities in conflict management. Bahruz made a point as to how the current conditions in Nagorno-Karabakh are such that people do not talk. Separation, stability without engagement is politically advanced by Azerbaijan. Local capacity is important. There are studies on this as well. We know that that capacity needs to be built. So societal connectivity and integration is also one that tracks with better outcomes. But I will simply conclude with this one, as I just finished a book manuscript, and it really let me, talking about this a lot on societal connectivity, the debate, the declinist debate, arguing that Sederman et al. Testing Ted Gore's analysis that over time, even before the end of the Cold War, accommodative capacities inside states, whether it's in form of federation, minority rights, or outright democratization, tracks better with overall decline of ethnic conflicts. So if that is the case, should we then be giving liberal peace building another chance and can focus on deepening it, or really trying to see whether dictators can produce peace outcomes? But the question I'm concluding with is, if we are seeking to understand the liberal peace building, how should we be assessing it? How do we need to assess it? And I'll stop here. I hope I did not go over, Susan.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, Bahruz. And my timer said you had 32 seconds left. So there we go. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And really, you've opened it up for us in terms of what do we mean by illiberal peace and the concept of, okay, so maybe we end things militarily, but then can there be a liberal peace building after that? Is that possible? What does that look like? So really, you've laid out concepts and also helped focus the questions very helpfully. So thank you. I'm glad that as we thought about the order, glad that that we started with this kind of conceptual approach. So thank you, Bahruz. Thank you, Anna. We'll now be turning to Dr. Tatsushi Arai, who is an associate professor at the School of Peace and Conflict Studies at Kent State University. I'll also add, since we have quite a Carter School audience here, that Dr. Tatsushi Arai is an alum of the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. So thank you, Tats. Appreciate you coming, and we'll turn it over to you.
Yay. So my dear friends, I am so happy to be virtually present and sharing this space. That first presentation I thought was fantastic. As Susan said, it opened up so much thinking. And my presentation is titled Functional Coexistence in Intractable Conflict, a decades-long view of conflict transformation. Let me just tell you upfront that I share with my predecessors two things, among other things. Number one is the use of negative peace as a starting point. Should we find a way to use negative peace or not? Number two is that when I say functional coexistence, which I will define in a moment, there is a semblance of illiberal peace, except that my thinking would frontline the message of coexistence, which is a relational message, whereas this can be an underlying basis of how illiberal peace or liberal peace axis may come about. And I have more observations to be made in terms of the connection between mine and my predecessor's presentation, but let me just start with the premise of my presentation. I choose as a point of departure, as well as a focus on significance of my theory building exercise as the Rohingya Rakhine conflict I've been engaging for a long time now. Conceptually, I am asking a question about the relationship between our field's long-term commitment to seeking common ground for resolution. I'm referring to John Burton, Roger Fisher, among many other people. And then a much under-researched, yes, significant area of inquiry that's needed, in my view, to stay constructively engaged in an enduring state of non-resolution. So I'll be referring to Bernard Meyer, Oliver Ramsbottom, among other people's contributions that I benefited a lot from. And to the extent that an enduring conflict is a situation of non-resolution, and we can definitely say that there's a lot of literature on either enduring conflict or my professor Chris Mitchell's contribution to intractable conflict, Chrisberg as well as protracted social conflict literature that many of us are familiar with. But let me just pick enduring conflict, especially Bernard Meyer's quote, which is very useful as a point of departure. He defines enduring conflict as an aspect of a dispute that is embedded in structures, systems, values, or identity, and will therefore not be resolved through short-term resolution or even conflict resolutions, interventions, sorry. Enduring conflict is long-lasting because of its nature, not because of ineffective or inappropriate efforts to resolve it. Until the roots of the conflict change, the system evolves, or the identity or value-based elements are profoundly transformed. Conflict will remain, although how it is manifested may vary over time. And again, this definition of enduring conflict resonates so much with the existing literatures on intractable conflict, protracted social conflict. And my basic argument throughout my presentation is that we need to spend a much more time on how to stay constructively, proactively engaged in an enduring state of non-resolution, because otherwise we'll be using different tools more for resolution, which are not so helpful at times with the enduring state of non-resolution. So my proposal is to introduce an idea of functional coexistence. I define functional coexistence as a sustained negative peace in an enduring intractable conflict with existential characteristics. What I mean by this is simply that there is an intersection of enduring negative peace, the absence of direct physical violence, and the state of mutual denial on non-recognition. I can elaborate as needed on what I mean by existential characteristics, but suffice it to say that there is a state of active mutual denial, either at the political level or societal level. And my working definition of existential is of this nature. Now, Bernard Meyer actually uses intriguing example in interpersonal conflict. Let us say a couple who unfortunately got divorced with profound sad reasons, and the child born was 2 years old, and the couple would embrace the reality of not talking to each other, but the child has many decades to go. What would a resolution of this conflict look like? Bernard Meyer says that there's no resolution to it. It is a question of how to embrace the sustained condition of non-resolution. Now, it's a metaphor, because my inquiry is to look at a much broader international and externalized international strife. And then I'll be listing some of the historical or potential contexts. Potential is emphasized, where functional coexistence is relevant. Italicized contexts are the ones in which I'm working or have worked substantively in. So examples include Taliban and Washington, D.C., Afghanistan and Pakistan over the border, the Durand Line, as well as the Pakistani military support for the Taliban, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria is a Palestine-Arab conflict, which actually was the trigger for me to think about functional coexistence back in 2008 as a practitioner. Iran-Saudi relations, North Korea, South Korea, USA relations, Sri Lanka, Tamil, Sinhalese relations, Rohingya, Rakhine, Burma relations, which have been changed significantly because of the coup d'etat, India, Pakistan over Kashmir. So I think you get a sense of the universe of cases I'm looking at here. I would like to echo my predecessor's presentation. I would like to add one more dimension to my theory building exercise. That is to expand and extend the notion of conflict transformation, which I define as a long-term process of change in which different types and levels of actors from across social divides overcome a destructive conflict while building awareness of power relations behind the conflict to realize more equitable relationships and social structures. Now, I am proposing that a functional coexistence with existential characteristics can be accommodated within a historical macro framework of conflict transformation, except that there is one deficit in the literature of conflict transformation as I see it. I'm just picking Jean-Paul Ledlac's illustration as an example of the larger context of literature. That is that the cyclical nature of the structure process dialectic, people like Jean-Paul Ledlac suggest that there are lots of setbacks where we are engaged in an enduring state of non-resolution. But I think literature is a bit silent on how do we cope with those setbacks? What would happen if we have so many setbacks over decades? And so I would attempt to fill this gap to an extent possible. Now, let me just get into two case studies that I am exploring briefly. The first case study I picked, which is a little outside Southwest Asia group, but there is a historical value to it, divided Germany and divided Europe during the Cold War. And I'm introducing something called elastic boundaries of mutual non-recognition. What do I mean by that? If I take a simply Cartesian space, whereby on the y-axis, you have a gradation from more formal, less institutionalized, that is, and less formal and more formal, meaning more institutionalized. And then on the x-axis, I am taking more individual-based action, meaning less organizational constraints and more collective, working as groups. Then this, space actually refers to the context in which functional coexistence, negative peace with an existential nature conflict oscillates, goes back and forth. Remember, the premise is that the key parties have not recognized each other. Existential. But then what I want to show, using the German and European context, is that let us say in 1969, the Warsaw Pact allowed each of its member states to start bilateral normalization talks with West Germany, which is breaking the norm of non-recognition. Then by 1933, West and Eastern and Germany's attained UN membership through mutual recognition. While the intra-German relations are evolving on a much broader scale of the Finnish-based confidence building, the Helsinki process, 35 foreign ministers were able to agree upon 3 baskets of action plans, procedural mainly, and that became the basis for CSCE, which then became the basis for OSCE, as everybody knows. But up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and during the Cold War, all these elastic boundaries shifted within the basic, at least a nominal premise of non-recognition. This is not an isolated case of the elastic boundaries of non-recognition. I am taking another case study in which I've been working for now 16 years as a facilitator of civil society dialogue across Taiwan, China, US. So the logic is the same here. And Taiwan and China have many elements of existential relationship, as everybody knows. But as of 1933, there is a lukewarm, very loose mutual understanding of different interpretations of one China, which are now disputed today, admittedly. But within that framework, the relationships evolved for 20 years, 20, I said decades, yeah? Then China-Taiwan summit, the first of its kind, took place. Of course, the relationship across the Taiwan Strait is in crisis now. So I am not depicting a rosy picture. I am merely saying that based on the premise of non-recognition, if you step back, look at those relationships in terms of decades, where the parties in the midst of the storm would say, we will never negotiate, we'll never recognize, nothing, nothing, nothing. But in terms of decades, things are shifting dramatically. So these are empirical realities. But as a practitioner of peace building, I'm asking a very proactive, practice-oriented question here. That is, how can conflict transformation practitioners build intentionally, proactively on functional coexistence as a basis for long-term systemic conflict transformation? Now, I think I'll be publishing a journal article on this in a couple of months, hopefully. So I'll be just arguing in detail. But one of the arguments I'm just laying out in response to my own question is the need to look at short-term or long-term perspectives of conflict engagement strategically. Meaning that, many of us, English-speaking scholar practitioners, get grants, do a time-bound projects, take actions, workshops, seminars, etc. And I do many of those things myself. And I always scratch myself, head and said, so how does this particular dialogue, this series of 15 dialogues I did, actually start shaking the mountains and the universe of the long-term process-oriented dynamics? So I always try to find a way in which actions and projects which are time-bound and short-term can contribute toward long-term processes and patterns which bear some characteristics of conflict transformation. For example, shifts in systemic relations, or doing the resolution of destructive conflict in such a way as to build relationships, etc., etc., etc. But I can ask this question within the context of the elastic boundaries of mutual recognition. I'm just placing the same diagram within this context here. So if I were a practitioner taking certain actions, projects, workshops, then placing myself in this Cartesian space, what are some of the strategic ways in which I can push the boundaries of non-recognition, mutual recognition, in such a way as to open up more possibilities for processes and patterns? As I work on these and other ideas, I'm going to just leave with one question that is disturbing to me, that I didn't ask Professor Mitchell and others when I was an Esra student, but it took me 16 years of scholarship and practice to come to this question of contextual transformation, which I define as a broad category of macro historical shifts, which are largely independent of intervention efforts, but which can be accelerated by matching intervention efforts. So by macro shifts, I mean global pandemics, the internet digital revolutions, demographic changes, climate-induced disasters responses, as a possible shift toward a post-oil world. In other words, those big mountains, as I'm showing in a picture. I always learn, maybe I was not a good student, that these things are contextual factors to keep in mind. But as a young, immature scholar practitioner, I always wanted to change the mountains. But after 16 years, I'm not giving up, but I learned some inconvenient truth. I cannot change them. They move. I'm not the only person in the universe. But like a surfer being able to surf on big, what do you call it, the tides, I should be more keen on observing how the tectonic plates move and find a strategic wise matching actions. So be it the illiberal peace, a functional coexistence, this kind of matching actions, seeing tectonic plates shifting for contextual transformation, I would argue has to be taught from day one of a Carter School classes, Kent State classes, and so on and so forth, which I didn't learn. So with this, I end my remarks, and I think I was within time limits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tats. Really stimulating, and yes, within time limits, and also really so full. You've given us the concept of functional coexistence, that sustained negative peace in an enduring intractable conflict with existential characteristics. You presented the elastic boundaries of mutual non-recognition, from the individual to the collective, the informal to the formal. And then for me as a scholar practitioner with my practitioner hat on, I find it so useful to think about how can conflict transformation practitioners build on functional coexistence as a basis for long-term systemic conflict transformation. And I think that's relevant to so many of the contexts that many of us work in. And I also want to think about how can I shift from the short-term actions to add up to long-term processes and patterns. And thank you for keeping in mind the big mountains and the tectonic plates that shift, and pandemics happen and climate change happens. And yeah, how can we work with those changes? Yeah, even though none of us individually, that inconvenient truth, but we can focus on them. So thank you for that, all those inputs.
You were also a hell of a good student, Tats.
Thank you. That's a big compliment from my professor.
So thank you. We now will turn to actually another alum of the Carter School. So here we are in the Carter School's Peace Week, and glad that we've got two of our alums on this, three if you count myself too. We've got several alums speaking on this panel. We'll now turn to Dr. Philip Gamaghelyan. He is an assistant professor at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. Phil, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Anna, Bahruz, and Tats for starting us off, and really for giving this very comprehensive conceptual start to the discussion, because we are shifting towards, away at least from liberal peace paradigm and towards something. And that something is certainly very central to the debate, and yet what is it? It's very hard to conceive. So this opens the space for me to focus on that practitioner angle of the conversation, and how all this conceptual debate really translates into what non-state actors, what I mean by non-state actors is NGOs, academics, people like us in this screen, are how we are trying to navigate this shift that is very visible, both conceptually and practically on the ground in conflict context. And I bring here a couple of hats. So I'm also a scholar practitioner. So as a practitioner, I've been involved for many years now in peace building efforts, up until recently conceived in very liberal sense in post-Soviet space, Turkey, Armenia as well, some in Syria, so somewhat regionally, but in that part of the world that Anna and Bahruz also discussed. But I'm also a scholar, as already mentioned. I'm an assistant professor at the University of San Diego. I'm also a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge, where together with a colleague from Turkey, Pinar Sayan, we are currently studying exactly this topic. How do non-state actors adjust to this changing world? But also, so part of the research is working for the actors, as in NGOs, academics, and others who are trying to adjust and find their place. But also with those who left, who have been peace builders, but decided to abandon it and either turn to war or became skeptics. Also state actors and how they perceive the role, essentially a pretty big range of skeptics, opponents, let's say, of peace building, as well as of peace builders themselves. So that research is somewhat preliminary. We just started a few months ago, so my findings also will be preliminary as a result. But I want to turn very briefly to the conceptual part of the argument. Is illiberal peace possible, right? Is it peace? Are we talking about positive or negative peace? And we somewhat, with Pinar and me, as in my colleague with whom we are writing, decided to adopt somewhat different terminology. So instead of illiberal peace, talk more about peace building in non-democratic societies. So that seemed to be more clear, as in where there is potentially a role for actors, non-state actors, effectively, without necessarily accepting the illiberal peace as peace. And second point, that we also decided to go away from the concept of positive and negative peace for a very different reason. There is also growing literature on peace and war, or peace and violence not being opposites. So in any society, particularly non-democratic societies, these two effectively always coexist. And so in any non-democratic society, we have at least structural violence, a lot of times also very manifest direct violence, and yet we also have peace. Even in case of very direct war with militaries engaged, you still have big parts of the society living in relative peace. So considering that, our focus is on more on how to maximize the presence of peace in a space where peace and war, or peace and violence coexist. So with this introduction, the context I'm looking into in this talk are Turkey, Armenia, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, the two that I've been pretty closely involved with. And in these two contexts, the peace building for last 3 decades was conceived, at least conceived, in a liberal sense. As a liberal peace, which is something now we are suddenly very aware of and actively critiquing, although up until a year ago, that seemed to be peace building as such, without the need to be named. I agree here with Anna and Bahruz, who mentioned that the liberal peace was never really given a chance. I believe it was applied there in name only, and I spoke about it in the past, in the sense that if you look into what liberal peace entails, at least in a comprehensive sense, the way it was implemented in post-World War II Europe, almost very few of these structures that were put in place in that context were really applied outside of Europe. So there was no transitional justice. There was no cooperation in any kind of supranational structures. In fact, there was no diplomatic relations in any form at all. There was no minority rights and human rights other than on paper. The democratization processes faltered from the start, and so on. So essentially, war crimes were never addressed. Histories were never rewritten. So none of these extremely important pillars of building liberal peace were even conceived, let alone implemented. So all we really had was NGO cooperation, which is one important part, but one particular part of liberal peace building, and that substituted for the stand-in essentially for this, whatever liberal peace was supposed to represent. So we had little chance but to fail, even if it was implemented. But there is a second part to the question, of course: what if they were implemented? Would they succeed or not? And that's an important conversation that needs to be considered on its own. Now, why I'm talking about liberal peace then, if we didn't have really liberal peace in any comprehensive sense, as in liberal peace building rather, is because even though it was not implemented, peace building was conceived very much in a conceptual framework of liberal democracy building and essentially applying all of these norms of liberal peace. There was very little question what peace building was. The blueprint was very clear. In a way, we were following the post-World War II experience, presumably implementing somewhat a series of actions that were very much well conceived in liberal democratization process. The assumption was that we are all eventually becoming liberal democracy. Even if we were faltering on the road, that was the trajectory we were going towards. And eventually it would be some form of either European Union integration or some form of regional integration, similar to what happened to European Union, with civil society essentially holding the space as a safety net for regulating interethnic relations and things like that, similar to that. Now, what's important now is not that necessarily something in practice changed, because again, there was very little of liberal peace building implemented, but the concept changed. At least Turkey and Azerbaijan are not at all showing any signs of interest in moving towards democratization. So that's in a way is not anymore part of the big picture. And Armenia and other parts of this region are perhaps somewhat more democratic. We can argue that I will also argue it's very questionable, and they are putting in place many structures that are expressly anti-democratic. So even that democracy is partial and has very little chance of developing any further than it already is. So what does that leave us with is that we have a space where essentially the NGOs and academics and those non-state actors who were functioning with an assumption, non-questioned really assumption, including by the states until recently, that this trajectory towards liberal democratization is what we are part of, and where governments, authoritarian, were allowing us to function because we had a kind of shared conceptual understanding on where we are going, are not all that welcoming anymore, and the role of non-state actors is actively questioned. And a lot of them are very actively under attack. So against this background, when now we interview either those who are opposing peace building or those who are trying to survive and somehow move forward, a number of findings come true, and unfortunately, in a big picture, they are quite pessimistic. At the same time, they show where the work is possible and necessary. As I mentioned from the beginning, some of these are rather preliminary, and hopefully in a few months as we publish our articles, they'll be better elaborated. But some preliminary important findings. One is that in absence of liberal democratic framework, we shouldn't expect the NGOs to be transformative actors. So that was a very big burden until now put on NGOs from the society, from the donor community, from the governments that, given 2-3 decades of peace building, why do we have a war, right? Why don't we move towards actual peace? So that concept should shift because, again, only NGOs functioning in non-democratic space without the rest of the liberal democratic doctrine in place, there's very little they can accomplish in terms of moving the mountains, to use Tat's terminology. It doesn't mean the NGOs have no role, but what the role is should be changed. The way we look at what they are able to achieve and why they are necessary should change. And what we see is two very distinct trajectories where they are very important. One is a humanitarian work, which is still best done by NGOs. And humanitarian can be conceived quite broadly, some of it in a more traditional sense, as in support for people affected by conflict, psychological support, physical support. But others also a bit more traditional in the sense of turning inwards and trying to support themselves. Because if what we had in the past was a very heavy investment into the NGO sector and this independent academia, and people were expected to be public and essentially transform the discourse and transform the structures, that is anymore not necessarily feasible any longer, again, given that the societies are moving in a rather non-democratic direction, and simply preserving the few individuals perhaps who are trying to counter this dominant militarist and violent and anti-democratic discourse on its own becomes an issue, a big value, than simply supporting the presence of the few actors who are trying to sustain an alternative discourse becomes a very paramount and yet not a given. Why? Because they are under very heavy attack in all these societies by far-right forces, a lot of times very physical attacks, and they're not being protected by the state, which was the case up until 2-3 years ago. We saw that in Georgia recently, we are seeing that in Armenia, and these are the ones that are relatively democratic. In Azerbaijan and Turkey, you have actually not only far-right groups, but also the governments themselves actively persecuting anybody that is talking about peace in any active form. So really turning inwards and trying to protect these folks, create networks of support, and simply survive in the atmosphere where essentially changing mountains, moving the mountains is simply impossible, should become kind of this inward loop into self-care, and self-preservation is an important part of the current non-state actor activity. That also changes the meaning of things like dialogue. So dialogue in the past assumed that we are bringing representatives of the two parties together who will agree on something and then transform their societies and move towards eventual peace. That is also essentially similar to everything else, is not feasible, the transformation itself. Yet dialogue becomes important, and on a particular example I've mentioned this. During the war in Nagorno-Karabakh just a few months ago, just the day of the war, we were about to start a new dialogue process between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And as organizer, my initial inclination was to call it off. Simply, I thought it's not bad timing and not safe. And when we sent an email to the participants offering to cancel the dialogue, all but one wrote back saying, no, this is extremely needed right now because me as a person who is opposed to war, I feel very isolated. and I need others who I can simply be in the same space with, because otherwise I'm surrounded by people who attack me and I question my own values and beliefs. So it became more of a therapeutic forum rather than dialogue conceived in the past, and yet I would say it was perhaps one of the most impactful dialogues I've been involved with, precisely because it happened during war. It changed, so this is one, what to do, what is the role of the non-state actors. This change also created a sharp distinction, what I'm seeing, between insiders and outside peace builders. So in the past, we talked a lot about insiders and outsiders, and we thought they were different. And yet now looking back in hindsight, they weren't, we weren't rather. Qualitatively different, because even insider or outsider, locals or foreigners, we were pretty much following the similar blueprint. We were doing the exact same things. Our identities were different. Kind of the shift away from that clear framework really did show that, create maybe a new, very clear distinction between the two. Because as a profession, peace building failed to a degree for locals. Because as a local is no longer a viable profession. In the past, it was a pretty well-paid job to be an international NGO representative, say in Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Turkey. It was respected, right? You had a voice, you had quite good income. And now is not the case anymore, and you are a direct target, physical target. So only those remained in the field really internally, and insiders are only those who are truly committed to peace and are doing it with a very physical or psychological risk to their lives. Right? So it's a very small group of people, but it's a much more committed group of people. And the outsiders, essentially outside peace builders, are, I would say, in somewhat of an identity crisis in this sense, and what do they necessarily bring right now at this point? And you can see it even when it comes to international fora. The voice of outsiders, neutrals, let's say, was always very loud, and they were much more visible. And suddenly you have a very clear shift where they simply are not as relevant right now for the conversation, and there is much more focus on for truly trying to hear out the local voices. That wasn't the case until recently. So this is in a way a silver lining also when it comes to the donor community and the funding that goes for peace building, because what was happening in the past decade or two, the shift was increasingly toward funding big consortia of essentially DC, London, Brussels-based organizations who, and perhaps local, but very big local organizations, a very small consortia, a very small number of actors who had this extremely technocratic approach to peace building that was really not reaching anything beyond the small circles in the capitals. So that's, although at the same time we had a lot of talk about turn to local and supposedly listening to the local voices, it wasn't necessarily taking place. There's a lot of literature on that on its own. So what's happening now, there is for real, for the first time I'm seeing in my career, there is a true interest from the donor community to listening to the locals, and not in a traditional sense of big NGOs in the capitals, but really going to the ground and asking where is the support needed. And that can really create this opening that if we combine this, who stayed in peace building are the true believers essentially, and the donors do not know what to fund and don't have a clear conceptual framework to impose, there might be a good potential collaboration where a genuine partnership based on the needs that come from the ground is articulated. So I think I'll summarize and to not run over my time is that essentially surviving and mutual support for the few peace builders in non-democratic spaces should be the focus, simply keeping an alternative space alive. Expecting them to shift mountains right now is simply out of picture. It's not early 90s where liberal democracies won the day. There is a massive need to focus on humanitarian work, because the more non-democratic we are, the more human rights violations are taking place, the more people are in need. And that includes self-care. So not only peace builders helping others, but there should be a very heavy focus on helping the peace builders themselves, which is not necessarily all that actively considered. And there is a genuine interest now from what we see from international partners and donors to listen, hear what's happening on the ground and support that. And it's important for that trend not to be short-lived, but actually continue in the long term. So I'll stop there, Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. Again, this this panel, we go from one excellent presentation to another. This was really, really helpful with you've really kind of, I mean, I love how you've taken the big themes from, you know, the way the field has talked, for example, about positive peace and negative peace. And you've said, wait a minute, what's really going on here? It's, you know, there's war and peace at the same time. And to then kind of question, what are we doing today and how has the world shifted so that what can NGOs really be doing today? And let's be realistic about that. So it's very sobering and I think helpful in terms of, you know, you've reflected on practice in a way that pulls out the theory for today that then gives guidance to practitioners for today and tomorrow too. So really, really helpful and clarifying this illiberal piece in practice. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we are moving right along then to Dr. Esra Dilek. We will turn to you. You are a Fulbright scholar here at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Great to have you with us today, Esra.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to share my presentation. Okay. I'm very happy for being part of this panel, and actually the previous presentations have been mind-opening for me, even you know, listening to them in terms of conceptual issues and how we are going to deal with this emerging illiberal peace agenda. My presentation will be about Turkey, but about Turkey's intrastate conflict and Turkey's internal experience in peacemaking, following Phil's presentation about Turkey's external relations with its neighbors. And it's actually a presentation about situating Turkey within this illiberal peace framework and trying to see how, to what extent it fits to the discussions that are going on currently in the literature about what illiberal peace is and how can we observe it. I'm happy that previous presenters and especially Anna at the beginning kind of made some clarifications about the concepts and practice of illiberal peace. We have different perspectives related to the deficiencies of liberal peace building. We have perspectives about the rise of illiberal actors and such as Russia and China and the impact of this rise for illiberal peace processes in certain regions. But I think Turkey clearly fits the third maybe perspective that I have here, which is the idea about how authoritarian conflict management has been becoming prominent in certain parts of the world, in certain countries, not only following Victor's peace or negotiated settlements, but being also a characteristic of frozen conflicts, or we can simply observe it in many different contexts and instances. And for Turkey, actually, I think that Turkey is a clear example. What's going on in Turkey since 2015, especially since the stalling of the peace negotiations that we had between 2013 to 2015, is an authoritarian management of conflict, which was followed by an experience of hybrid negotiations. This is a simple flow of how Turkey engaged in a peace process that started in 2009. But because before getting into the details of the process itself, I need to give a little bit of background, because that background kind of shaped how the subsequent peace process evolved. First of all, in terms of the conflicts between the Turkish state and the Kurdish armed group PKK, we had a very important shift in 1999 with the capture of the PKK leader who is currently imprisoned, and the subsequent ceasefire that the armed group declared, and the change in the agenda actually of the armed group, which shifted from separatists agenda to expressing needs about democratization and decentralization as a way for addressing the grievances of the Kurds, especially in the eastern regions in Turkey. We also, starting from the early 2000s, had a democratization process, democratic reforms that were related to Turkey's effort to become part of the European Union. And this kind of provided the basis for AKP to get into power in 2002 and build its political agenda starting from 2002 and onwards. And this kind of formed the background for the AKP to establish a kind of state policy for addressing the Kurdish conflict for the first time in the history of the Turkish Republic through a democratization process. It was first labeled as the Kurdish opening in 2009, but later on, because the public was not really prepared for it, they had to change the name to the Democratic Opening, something more neutral. And they proposed the Unity and Fraternity Project. And basically the aim was to address the demands of the Kurds about democratic problems, about cultural rights, partially, of course, and try to solve the conflict in this way. But it became quickly apparent that that was not the way to solve or to address the conflict itself. There was a brief return to conflict in 2010 to 2011. And then a process of peace negotiations started in late 2012 that lasted until mid-2015. And they took the format of talks between representatives from the government side and also the intelligence agency in Turkey, and also representatives from the Kurdish side, including maybe indirectly the imprisoned leader and also the commanders, PKK commanders that are in neighboring countries in Turkey, in the neighboring countries. But the process was stalled in 2015, and I'm going to explain how we transitioned to this authoritarian conflict management phase that I think it's currently ongoing. There were certain problems with the negotiation process itself. Some major structural problems were related to the asymmetry that existed between the government and the Kurdish sides. The government tried to maintain a hierarchical relationship within the negotiation process, and the most clear indicator here was that it did not, the government did not want to directly speak to the armed group and the imprisoned leader, and it kind of used the Kurdish political party as an in-between messenger, so that to exchange some ideas, and prefer to do this more in a unidirectional way. So this hierarchical, let's say, power structure was there, and the government did its best to maintain it, and therefore it's even questionable whether we can speak of genuine negotiations there. And the second structural problem was that the process was not inclusive. Actually, it did not include the civil society. It did not include any interests outside of the elite level. And I'm not speaking about direct inclusion. There were not even indirect mechanisms through which the civil society could express, let's say, its expectations about the process. Also, why I'm referring to this phase as hybrid is because I think that there was this effort for cherry picking norms and processes that are associated with liberal peace building, but at the same time maintaining illiberal aspects as much as possible. So, for example, the AKP government used democratization as a means to appease, the demands of the Kurdish population, but at the same time prioritized disarmament and demobilization. So it kind of sets DD, not even DD, as a prerequisite for the negotiations. And that's one of the main reasons why the negotiations did not eventually lead anywhere. It also rejected third-party roles, it rejected mediation, it rejected monitoring or facilitating third parties, although that was one of the main calls by the Kurdish side, because they were unsure about how long the process could be maintained under these conditions. And also both sides adopted a kind of an ambiguous stance towards transitional justice. If it, they kind of supported anti-impunity to the extent that it fits their perspectives. They were not very clear about how to have retribution and restoration of injustices that happened in the past. And the process eventually stalled in summer 2015, related to both domestic and regional developments. First of all, the war in Syria had a great impact on the process, and it was a kind of a spillover. What happened in northern Syria was a spillover to the protests that happened in 2014 and continued in 2015, that kind of prepared the ground for the end of the negotiation process. But at the same time, in June 2015, Turkey had general elections where, for the first time since coming to power, the AKP lost its parliamentary majority. And that the reason why it lost its majority was that the Kurdish political party increased its vote share. And this actually formed a pretext for the government to stop the negotiations and go back to divisive political discourse. The elections were repeated, quote unquote, in November 2015, and with this phase, with this political instability and increasing, let's say, oppression by the AKP government, there is a huge discussion about how Turkey transitioned actually to competitive authoritarian system in its political, in its domestic politics, which refers to the observation that although democratic politics are at place, we have regular elections, and seemingly there is still democracy functioning in some way. The system is designed in a way to, let's say, to facilitate the AKP's, let's say, domination within the system. It controls the media. There is a control of free speech is suppressed, and also with a transition to a presidential system in 2018, we can say that there is a huge authoritarian control of the virtual democratic system that exists. And this, of course, has its own parallel with regards to how the government is approaching the conflict today since 2015. First of all, we saw a shift in the discourse with the end of the negotiations. I have 3 points in terms of how the discourse shifted to a more divisive and a more oppressive discourse. First of all, the idea that local problems have local solutions was one of the basic things that dominated, let's say, the political discourse in terms of the Kurdish conflict, that Turkey needs to define herself her own way of dealing with her internal problems, because she has a specific history and a specific cultural setup that requires a certain way of dealing with problems. That obviously is an illiberal way of dealing with problems, rather than solving them through negotiation and finding a common solution. A second shift in the discourse was about this friend-enemy distinction, distinguishing between authentic and fake citizens, who is part of the true Turkish society, who is a true Turkish citizen or citizen of Turkey, versus who is a fake and unwanted and eventually an enemy, let's say, of the state. And this doesn't have to do with who lives in Turkey or outside of Turkey, because the discourse was based on the idea that there are there's a Turkish diaspora, for example, that is authentic and true to the Turkish society because they are part of that society and they support Turkey in any way. But there are other citizens that live within Turkey that are not part of this true citizen, let's say, idea. And a third way that the discourse leans towards authoritarian conflict management is using religion as a way of co-opting demands of the Kurdish ethnic group. There's a whole discourse on which can be summarized as my Muslim Kurdish brothers, and it's a way of projecting Islam as being the overarching identity, and therefore ethnicity shouldn't be a problem, or the problems related to any ethnic group shouldn't be discussed in the public sphere. Also, in terms of judicial practices, there was a lifting of the immunity of Kurdish politicians, and today many party members are imprisoned. There is a purge of the Kurdish political party that is actually something that it's not new to this space. It has been an issue for Turkey since the past a couple of decades, when Kurdish political parties existed. And also trials of party members are continuing. And this is also a way of managing the conflict, the judicial practices, through suppressing the opposition that is related to the Kurdish movement or supporting the Kurdish movement. In terms of special control also, we can speak of the presence of increased security patrols and increased military presence in the eastern part of the country, where most of the Kurdish cities are. But I think more importantly, in terms of special control, is this issue where the elected mayors of municipalities, the elected Kurdish mayors, were removed and appointed trustees were replace them. Which is a way of controlling the region, controlling both the territory and also controlling how local governance is taking place. And finally, in terms of economic practices, clientelism is a huge problem today. And this clientelism has also an impact on the management of the conflict, because only loyal clientele networks are part of the are kind of included in the economic practices as much as possible, and the rest are just left outside of these networks, which obviously has a negative impact on the conflict and on the prospects for peace in Turkey. I think that's all on my part.
Well, Esra, thank you so much. Really, really helpful to have your analysis of, one specific case, one specific set of negotiations over many stages as things shifted from one stage to another, and different sorts of cherry picking of the liberal peace building approaches. And yeah, to have a deep analysis of the post-2015, what you call the authoritarian conflict management, competitive authoritarianism, et cetera. So thank you for bringing this all kind of alive with an analysis of one specific case. That's a great way to ground today's discussion in the case. So thank you. Thank you very much. We now will turn to Dr. Christopher Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is the Emeritus Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And he's the one who convened today's session. I'm so grateful that you've convened this, Chris. It's been a fabulous discussion, and return to you for the concluding presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Thing about going last on a panel is that you end up really wanting to throw out what you've prepared because of what you've heard, and start again. And particularly this, for me anyway, is the result of listening to Anna and the rest of you. What I had originally intended to do was to talk about what seemed to me an extraordinarily obvious case of victor's peace. A peace which follows a military victory, where one side completely crushes the other, and then has the job of actually running the society which it has won. And then I started making scribbles from all of your presentations, and the one scribble that actually seemed to me to be most helpful was Anna's point about, well, okay, if you actually end a conflict, if you terminate a conflict in a military victory, is it possible to have some kind of a liberal set of post-war conditions? Or is it almost inevitable that the winners, imposing what their vision for the society was, end up with a highly illiberal situation? I mean, the case that I started to think of was, if you look at the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, which to the rest of you, I guess, is ancient history. I mean, it was a period of vengeance, and we're only just discovering how bad that particular time was after the nationalists had won. What I originally started to try and do was to think I might present to you a case of another civil war, which ended in a complete victory for one side, in this case, the federal government, and the complete defeat of the movement to try to achieve an independent state, the state of Biafra. In other words, what I'm talking about is something that happened 50 years ago. It's sometimes called the Nigerian Civil War, sometimes it's called the Biafran War. And I wanted to take that as an example because it seemed to me to be an unusual example, which suggests that maybe it's a case for Anna of a military victory which ended up with some kind of a liberal set of conditions. It's an example, if you like, of a victory leading to a set of post-war activities which were intended to lead to some form of long-term reconciliation. But I think probably, referring to what Tats has said, it's probably led to some kind of peaceful coexistence, or functional coexistence. All right. I'm not going to go very deeply into the war in Nigeria. Lasted from, roughly speaking, 1966 to 1970. It was 3 years of overt fighting. It was mainly, I think, if you ask the question, what are the original causes of this? One answer, I guess, is it was the mess the British left behind when they departed from Nigeria in 1960. Nigeria, in defense of the British, and I have to defend the British because I'm British, is actually an extremely heterogeneous society. It's something like 250 different ethnic groups within the boundaries of the country, 250. There are something like 500 different languages within Nigeria. The major ethnic groups are the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the east. There are about 30% Hausa Fulani, 20% Yoruba, about 16% of the population are Igbo. When the British left, they actually left a political system whereby the Hausa Fulani, simply by the numbers that they had, dominated the federal government. And for 6 years, the situation went from bad to worse. It was a case where there were contested elections, where there was a census, which was contested because people were constantly trying to inflate the size of their particular ethnic group. There was a general strike in the Western sector. By 1966, the divisions, the cleavages within the country were becoming politicized and militarized because, of course, the Nigerian army, again, was divided into different ethnic groups with different loyalties. What happened at the end of the beginning of 1966 was a military coup. It was a military coup that was led by a series of officers that came from the Igbo ethnic community. And it was a military coup which ended up with the assassination, the murder of a large number of federal officials. The actual prime minister of the northern region, the federal government, the president were assassinated, and these were all Hausa Fulani. There were no serious deaths among the Igbo, and the coup was very rapidly put down by other members of the army, led by a general called Ironsi, who was himself was an Igbo and had actually been on the list of intended assassinations. To cut a long story short, this unleashed a whole wave of what we would call ethnic cleansing in the country. It resulted in the massacre and the flight of something like, well, figures are very difficult to come by, but something like 2 million Igbo fled their homes in the other regions and went back to the eastern region. The numbers of them who were killed are in dispute. Some figures are 200,000, some figures are 2 million. Anyway, what then happened, of course, was a period of military government under Ironsi. It was followed by what was called a counter coup, in which the Hausa Fulani officers and men in the military took over and killed Ironsi and several of the other leading generals. And at the end of the year, the Easterners had decided they'd had enough, and they declared themselves an independent state. They instructed the oil industry that was mainly located in the eastern region to stop paying royalties to the federal government in Lagos. They set up their own state. They set up their own very badly ill-equipped military, and they declared their independence. Federal government was absolutely intensely intended that the unity of the country should be preserved. The fighting broke out, and the war proceeded until the beginning of 1970. Looking back, it's very difficult to sort of recall the impact that this had on the, what we were beginning to call the international community. I mean, there were part of the strategy of the federal government was to use air power to bomb strategic targets. Well, we all know about bombing strategic targets, don't we? Does that include churches? Does it include marketplaces? Does it include any gathering of peoples? The other strategy was one of blockade and starvation. And looking back, I was in London at the time. The pictures that were produced of Biafran kids starving to death, suffering from numerous appalling and avoidable disease conditions. The Biafrans made a great deal of play out of this because they were trying desperately to get international recognition, but nobody important would actually recognize the independence of Biafra. The war ground on. Gradually, the territory controlled by the Biafrans was narrowed down. The Federals cut them off from the sea. Eventually, in January 1970, the leader of the Biafran forces, a gentleman called Ojukwu, I remember him appearing on a newsreel, exhorting his brave Biafran boys to fight on until the last moment, just before he stepped on to the steps of an aeroplane to take him to the Côte d'Ivoire, and the war came to an end. So, military victory. What was going to happen? And the thing that the Biafrans worried about was partly because of some of the broadcasts by the federal government, partly by some of the broadcasts of their own people warning of terrible things that were going to happen. There were going to be massacres, there were going to be mass executions, there were going to be Nuremberg trials for people who had actually taken up arms against the federal government. And so that was what they were worried about, and I think that's why they fought on for so long. Now, the extraordinary thing was that, in fact, none of this happened. What came about as a result of this military victory was a quite extraordinary strategy or policy, if you like, at least at the elite government level, which the British Prime Minister at the time, a guy called Harold Wilson, described as an example of a quite extraordinary strategy for binding up the wounds of war. The then federal president, a very, very unusual gentleman called Jack Gowan, who was a general, announced that this had been a disagreement among brothers. And he promulgated a strategy for the federal government of what he called the 3 R's: reconciliation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And the first thing that he focused on, of course, was reconstruction. Most of the damage was done in the eastern region. There had been only one campaign that the Easterners had carried out towards Lagos, and that had been very quickly beaten back. So the damage, the death, the starvation, etc., was mainly confined in the eastern region in Biafra. On January the 12th, 1970, Gowon announced a full amnesty for anybody who had participated in what he called the Biafran uprising. He also instructed any of the bureaucrats, civil servants who'd helped run the Biafran state for 3 years that they should immediately report to their regional capital for re-employment in the federal government. It was this was the official position, of course. It wasn't a position that everybody on the winning side agreed with. And so there were shortcomings in the implementation of many of the things that Gowon wanted to put into effect. And shortly afterwards, the government, which remember was a military government, it was generals, passed a decree called the Public Officers Special Provisions Decree that gave the free hand to any federal official to fire, get rid of, dismiss anybody who had helped the Biafran cause at all. But it was a quite extraordinary policy. It was a policy aimed at, remember, the first R was reconciliation. And so it's an interesting case. I'm now talking about something that happened 50 years ago. Did it actually produce long-term reconciliation between the Igbos and the other ethnic groups who had totally dominated the war? I mean, after all, the House of Fulani, the majority, had won the war. My old colleague, John Payton, who some of you remember from his time at GMU, who was he was the person who wrote most wisely about Nigeria. And I have had long discussions about whether, in fact, the reconciliation worked. In 50 years, it's difficult to say because of all sorts of things that happened subsequently in Nigeria. Well, John says, listen, you've got to realize the glass is half full. My answer is, yeah, but look at it from the Igbo point of view, the glass is half empty. There has never been an Igbo president in Nigeria. There's been a vice president. Look at the fact that the Igbo think there's a glass ceiling wherever they go. Okay, Susan.
So Chris, yes, if we can have you wrap up so we can turn then to a few minutes of discussion.
Yeah, okay. The last thing that makes me think that the glass is half empty is that several surveys have actually asked people in Nigeria how they identify themselves. They still tend to identify themselves by their ethnicity. I'm an Igbo, but I'm a Nigerian, of course. Or I'm a House of Fulani, but I'm a Nigerian. And so in a sense, if reconciliation is supposed to be something which transforms you into a different person, it hasn't worked. There are neo-Biafran movements, mainly in Igbo living overseas. I don't know whether the glass is half full or half empty, but I do know, I think, that Tatsu's point about having to be contented with some kind of functional cooperation as opposed to reconciliation is probably the best that we can aim for. So maybe we should try that as professional peace researchers or whatever. I don't know.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for being the one to go last after all these other presentations. And yet you've added so much to the discussion. I'm always learning from you and your engagement with history. So the case of Biafra, Nigeria, the history there, and that's really useful for us to look back at that and try to make sense. And I guess in terms of, is the glass half full or half empty? It might be both. It might be, the concept that Phil put forward. It's both war and peace. Maybe it's both half full and half empty at the same time for the glass. So we now have just 15 minutes for questions and discussion. And what I want to ask is for each of our panelists to reflect and just share maybe one thing, maybe one or two things, just in 1 or 2 minutes each. You can look at the chat questions that have been posted, or refer to each other's presentations. But you've heard a lot today from each other, and just to give each of you a minute or two to share one reflection, and then we'll turn to questions from the presenters, or from the participants rather. I see in the chat, for example, questions about trauma healing, restorative justice, espoused theory, theory in action. What do they look like in liberal peace building? What do they look like in illiberal peace building? Or what is a liberal peace in terms of trauma healing? What is an illiberal peace in terms of trauma healing? So feel free to engage with any of the chat discussions or engage with each other's. And we'll just go in the order from the panel. So Anna, we'll start with you for a moment, please.
Sure, and I'm not seeing Bahruz. He probably left. There is a time differences in Europe, so he's probably to bed. I am there's so much that was presented, that was laid out, and Chris, I really have to look at the Nigerian cases, Biafra in particular. But I wanted I keep thinking of Tat's presentation. I have to admit, I was looking forward to Tat's presentation for a variety of reasons. I've read only the abstract. What I would argue is critical in what Tat's presented is the engagement between actors and agency, the system, the dialogue groups that Phil is talking about, conflict management, the sort of the identity of the field, if you will. But really, it gives me at least one answer, that how to think about conflict management processes, perhaps dominated by dialogue groups, not necessarily dominated, but significantly built around dialogue groups, and broader institutional factors. So essentially building that functional coexistence while, if I understood you correctly, Tats, while essentially historical contextual changes are happening, and they do happen, that's one way to really think about diplomacy, I think, and conflict management. To that end, I would simply add that we have to remember as scholars and practitioners that conflict management processes on their own, they can have impact on what's happening to broader political institutions and vice versa. And I simply, because time is short, I simply would like to conclude that, I have several notes here, simply conclude by saying that there is a contradiction. It's really highlighting that point in conflict there's a contradiction within illiberal authoritarian conflict management logic of coercion versus the need for accommodation, which again, the large data shows is needed, and it really jumps out at you in Chris's example. So in that respect, I think that contradiction is something that I probably will be thinking about a lot. And I guess even if we do get our hands around the authoritarian, illiberal peace-building processes, sort of because of political realities, unless those systems are accommodating, even authoritarian systems will not go very far. Any outcomes that they achieve will not be sustainable. So I will stop here and pass this on to Tats.
Thank you, Anna. Tats, over to you.
My comments are meant to simply just stimulate conversations among the participants, all of us, either within this Zoom session or outside. To echo what Anna said, to me, there are actually three outstanding questions that cut across many of the presentations we just had. Number one is how to deal with negative peace. Should we accept negative peace as a starting point? And as Galtung conceptually said, positive peace is what we aim for. And that leads into my second question, which is more moral and value-oriented. Isn't it simply a resignation? If we choose to accept negative peace as a basis, or is that kind of moral discussion relevant in pragmatic contexts that are so real in front of us? And denying that reality is simply irresponsible. And as a student, I thought it was irresponsible. As a practitioner digging trenches, I grudgingly accepted that reality, even it contradicts my value. So I want to hear, what other people think about this dilemma. The third point is this. In textbooks, we learn about conflict management, resolution, transformation, conflict engagement in a sense of staying engaged in an enduring state of non-resolution, Bernard Meyer. But in practice, all those things always come together in different ways. And I'm just echoing what Anna said. So I think that as teachers, we teach so much of sort of dissected, compartmentalized concepts when the reality does demand much more mixed picture. So as teachers, I'm always compelled to think of how to actually share those methods as complementary rather than like academically contradictory to each other. So the illiberal peace discussion and functional coexistence highlight the importance of more nuanced hybrid approaches to intervention methods as well. So that's my third point.
Thank you, Tats. Thank you. Provocative questions. Phil, we'll turn to you for a moment.
Thanks. I'll start where Tats left off. For me, yeah, there is no question then. If there is a negative peace is all we have, we absolutely should take it and work on expanding it, because what's the alternative, essentially, allowed war, right? So if this is the best we have, and it is the best we have right now, to simply work with what we have, in my view, that's actually exactly the moral answer for myself, at least, right? It doesn't mean staying there, but absolutely working with actors who are able to support or at least implement that negative peace. Could be authoritarian actors. From there on, then it leads me to this question of, I talked about diminishing role of non-state actors, particularly NGOs. But also I see an opening, and this is a question I have. I see potentially an opening for more, let's say, analytic conversation, maybe having bigger impact than it had in the past. Why? Because as the space becomes more authoritarian, the public dialogue diminishes. Like in the more democratic space, you have a lot of voices constantly in a conversation. So in a way, a lot of opinions being voiced. So that is gradually decreasing. Just voicing anything becomes problematic, especially if it's very alternative. And that also means the governments don't necessarily have much of an input, because they are just listening to themselves. They are just pulling agenda forward. Where is it coming from? Especially in a space that is new. We don't have any more this liberal framework to work with. So I'm thinking here the more scholar practitioner role grows, as in potentially we can bring concepts forward, essentially, that could be help also the authoritarian governments, not only some imaginary future democratic one.
Thank you, Phil. Esra, we'll turn to you for a moment.
Thank you. I wish I had taken more notes from Anna's tables, and I found that so interesting. I was going to ask her to share it with us later on after the panel. But one thing from these tables that you had in the presentation is that the results, that one of the outcomes that you were talking about is about how we need to look at both patterns of termination and the outcome. So we tend to think that, okay, there is either liberal or illiberal, whatever, peace or structures or institutions. We tend to stick with binaries. I also admittedly probably do that when I'm looking at, what's going on around. But it's more beneficial to not to speak with binaries, but to look at patterns that might lead maybe to different levels of illiberal peace or different levels of authoritarian conflict management. And that's, I think, one of the main points that I will keep from our panel and the presentations. Other than that, I don't have a question myself. I found the whole panel very fruitful, and it's made me, have more and more questions, and I'm happy to, exchange ideas more and more about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Turn to Chris for a moment. Reflections on these reflections, if any.
Yeah, the question that I end up with at the end of the panel, and I agree with you, Susan, it was a very, very stimulating panel. And I hope we can sort of carry on in some way, shape or form with the discussion. Look, my question is, can we learn to live with non-resolution? And what does that look like? And how do we try to move towards a situation of non-resolution or functional coexistence, while still keeping in mind a final holy grail, if you like, which we'll never get to, of reconciliation? Because I don't think, to be honest, we're going to get there. But I think we'll probably get to functional coexistence. Maybe we should accept that.
Thank you.
I never thought of that 50 years ago when I was a student, but maybe wisdom comes with age.
So I'm going to say something perhaps unwise. As I listened to this panel, each of these presentations, I heard a book. I heard chapter by chapter presented. And I heard a book on illiberal peace, functional coexistence, negative peace, getting to reconciliation, appreciating non-resolution, but lack of all-out war, etc. So further discussions to be had. I saw that there was a hand up. Margarita Tadavosian. Dr. Tadavosian, you still here? Our research assistant professor at the Carter School. Can you have a participant word before we say goodbye?
Well, I had a question, but I think we're out of time, so I can follow up later. So that's, yeah, thank you. But it was very insightful, actually. I really enjoyed, especially like, again, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh is something that I'm very interested in. It was really helpful to have all this new perspectives for me.
Thank you. Well, with that, I want to
Susan,
thank...
are you completely crazy?
Yes, maybe.
I mean,
that's been well established.
Come on, you are
but...
now in the middle.
Oh, the book idea?
I
didn't say I would have anything to do with it. I just said it sounds like a book.
You're still struggling to get the last book out of the publisher's hands.
Yes, we will get the works cited citations figured out.
Yeah.
Well, so having established my insanity, but really, seriously, it was a fabulous panel, and I would love to read the book. I'm not saying I'll have anything else to do with it besides read it, but it sounded great. Really stimulating. And I think the field needs this. We need to take these ideas and put them out there because they are shaping the theory of the field, and they're also very important to the practice of the field. So I do actually mean that this was a really useful panel. I want to thank Chris Mitchell for pulling this panel together, being the inspiration for it and convening it. I want to thank our Dean Alp Ozerdem, who is convening the whole of Peace Week, for stimulating the idea of getting something together this week. I want to plug all these other things that we've got going on during Peace Week. We're coming towards the end. So if you look at this, I've just put in the chat the link towards the rest of Peace Week events. I want to plug particularly tomorrow at 1 o'clock, there's a panel in honor of the late Joe Campbellson, an extraordinary peace builder from Northern Ireland. There'll be a panel in his honor tomorrow at 1. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., there's a fabulous documentary. It's called Soldiers Without Guns. And as we think about the liberal and illiberal approaches, this was an example of peacekeeping that was done in an unarmed way. And the way that going in unarmed disarmed the participants in Bougainville and contributed to, it's a fabulous documentary. So I encourage everyone to sign up to watch that Friday, 6 p.m. here Eastern time. Thank you to the presenters. My goodness, Anna Bahruz, I'll have to send him a note to thank him since he's had to leave us given the time difference. Tats, Phil, Esra, Chris, thank you so much. And thank you, participants. Really appreciated the chat comments and your presence for this. And yes, Margarita, I'm sorry we ran low on time, but really appreciate your comment and hope that all of you will follow up with presenters as needed after this. So thank you very much.